From clay tablets pressed into wet earth 5,000 years ago to king lists that defy every timeline we've built since, the Sumerians left us records we still don't know how to read. We've always assumed ancient myths were humanity's first attempts to make sense of lightning, floods, and death. Poetic fictions wrapped around natural events. But the Sumerian archives tell a different story. They document beings called the Anunnaki with the same care they used to track grain shipments and land disputes, names, ranks, cities, arguments, failures. These weren't metaphors pressed into clay. They were records that treated gods the way census takers treat citizens. In this deep dive, we'll examine 10 claims preserved in cuneiform that archaeology cannot confirm and cannot dismiss. We'll trace rulers who reigned for tens of thousands of years, measured in units no one explains. We'll follow kingship that fell from the sky rather than rising from the earth. We'll witness gods who didn't act divine at all. They starved, panicked, and fled disasters they couldn't control. We'll uncover testimony that knowledge was inherited, not invented, and explore why the world's first civilization recorded a past that refuses to fit our definitions of history or mythology. Before we ascend deeper, hit that like button and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. So whether you're watching closely or just listening in, settle in and let the outside world fade for a while. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself and let's dive in. To understand why these Sumerian claims unsettle modern archaeology, you have to forget the epic poems first. Forget Gilgamesh. Forget creation myths. Start instead with something far more disturbing. Bookkeeping. Around 3200 BC, in the mudbrick cities of southern Mesopotamia, scribes began pressing reed styluses into soft clay, creating the world's first writing system. They weren't composing poetry. They were counting barley rations for temple workers, livestock inventories, labor assignments. The birth of writing was the birth of bureaucracy. Cold, precise, obsessively detailed. These were administrators, not storytellers. Their professional survival depended on accuracy. A scribe who miscounted grain faced punishment. A scribe who falsified temple records faced worse. And yet, buried in the same archives that carefully tracked every shekel of silver and every jar of oil, we find something that doesn't belong. Systematic records of beings called the Anunnaki. Not described as symbols or lessons or forces of nature, but catalogued with names, family lines, city assignments, and administrative hierarchies treated exactly like the human officials whose grain rations filled the tablets around them. The problem isn't translation. Cuneiform was cracked in the 19th century. Thousands of tablets have been read, cross-referenced, and published. We know what the Sumerians wrote. The problem is that what they wrote doesn't fit into any category we built to hold it. It's too organized to be mythology, too strange to be history, too consistent across centuries and cities to be dismissed as creative fiction. Consider what sits in the British Museum under catalogue number WB 444. The Sumerian king list, composed around 2100 BC. It is one of the most studied and most troubling documents from the ancient world. It's formatted like a royal record: city names, dynasty names, ruler names, reign links called, in order, administrative. But then you read the numbers. The opening line states, without ceremony after kingship descended from heaven. Kingship was in Eridu. The first king listed is Alulum. His reign, 28,800 years. Not a typo, not a mistranslation. 28,800 years. The second king, Alalgar, 36,000 years. The pattern continues through 8 rulers before the list adds almost casually, then the flood swept over. After the flood, the numbers drop, but remain impossible: 1,200 years, 900 years, 600 years. Only in the later dynasties do the reign lengths begin approaching what a human lifetime could hold. Scholars have wrestled with this document for over a century. The easy explanations don't hold. If these were symbolic numbers designed to glorify kingship, why are they presented with the emotional weight of a tax ledger? If they were oral traditions inflated over time, why does the list keep such a rigid mathematical structure? Why does every copy we found from different cities, different time periods preserve the same impossible numbers? And why does no Sumerian text ever explain them? There's no commentary, no footnote, no scribe adding, of course, these figures represent symbolic ages. The numbers simply sit there carved into clay, daring you to make sense of them. The king list isn't an isolated mystery. Across temple hymns, cosmological texts, and ritual instructions, the Anunnaki appear not as vague divine ideas, but as named individuals with specific jurisdictions. Enki: freshwater, craftsmanship, wisdom. Enlil: wind, storm, political authority. Inanna: love, war, the evening. star. Ninhursag birth, fertility, the mountains. These weren't Medup symbols. They were assignments, territories, portfolios. The texts described them making decisions, holding assemblies, arguing over policy. They described them eating, sleeping, growing tired from labor. They described them fearing the flood, not commanding it, but fleeing from it, starving after it, and swearing never to repeat the mistake. So we're left staring a clay pressed into permanence 50 centuries ago, holding testimony that doesn't behave like any category we created to contain ancient thought. The world's first record keepers recorded something. And whatever they recorded, we still haven't found the framework to read it properly. That's where this begins. The tablets describe a world that didn't begin with human rule. They describe a world where humans arrived late, after the structure was already in place, after kingship had been established, after someone else had already been in charge. This isn't buried in obscure fragments or damaged text. It's explicit. The Uridu Genesis, one of the oldest Sumerian creation accounts we possess, opens not with the creation of humanity, but with the division of the cosmos. The text describes how Enlil, Enki, and Ninhursag parceled out authority over heaven, earth, water, and land. Cities were founded. Irrigation channels were dug. Divine households were established. Then, almost as an afterthought, humans appear. They're not the climax of creation. They're not made in a divine image or given control over the earth. They're introduced as labor, created because the gods were exhausted from the work of maintaining civilization themselves. The Atrahasis epic, another Akkadian text, drawn from earlier Sumerian sources, makes this even clearer. The story describes a time when lesser gods, the Igigi, were forced to dig irrigation canals and maintain the cities. They revolted. They burned their tools and surrounded Enlil's temple, demanding relief. The solution wasn't negotiation or reform. It was replacement. Enki proposed creating humans to take the labor burden. The goddess Beltili mixed clay with the blood of the slain god, and humanity was formed not as rulers or explorers or inheritors of divine wisdom, but as workers. The text uses the word lulu, which roughly means primitive worker or labor. Humans didn't build the first cities. They maintained them. This goes against every story framework we use to understand early civilization. We're taught that humans invented agriculture, then surplus, then specialization, then cities. That culture evolved from simplicity to complexity. That the story of civilization is the story of human innovation. But the Sumerian texts reverse that sequence. In their telling, cities existed before humans. Kingship existed before humans. The irrigation systems that allowed Mesopotamian agriculture to flourish existed before humans. The social hierarchy, the administrative structure, the division of labor, all of it comes before humanity. The gods didn't arrive to rule human cities. Humans arrived to serve cities that were already working. The Sumerian temple hymns, a collection of praises to various sacred sites, reinforce this. The hymns describe temples in Eridu, Nippur, and Uruk as ancient even by Sumerian standards, buildings linked to the time before or the first time. Eridu in particular is consistently described as the oldest city on earth, founded by Enki before the flood, before kingship was distributed to other cities. Archaeology confirms Eridu's antiquity. Excavations have uncovered 17 building levels beneath the later Sumerian temples, with the lowest levels dating back to about 5400 BC. That's 1,700 years before writing, 2,000 years before the pyramids. But the Sumerian texts don't describe Eridu as a human settlement that eventually became sacred. They describe it as sacred from the beginning as Enki's city, his administrative center, his residence. Who was maintaining it before humans were created to do so? The texts don't explain. They simply assert it. And that assertion appears everywhere. In legal codes, humans receive laws. They don't create them. In agricultural texts, humans learn irrigation. They don't invent it. In ritual instructions, humans are told exactly how to perform ceremonies down to the exact wording of prayers and the precise measurements of offerings. The role of humanity in these texts is receiver, not creator. Even the concept of me, the Sumerian term for the basic laws and attributes that govern civilization, is described as something owned first by the gods and then transferred to humanity. The me included everything, from kingship and priesthood to writing, metalwork, music, and warfare. Over 100 specific me are listed in various texts, and every single one is described as a divine gift, not a human invention. This pattern holds across Sumer's temple archives. King lists, mythological epics, legal texts, hymns, lamentations. The Sumerians, across centuries and across cities, consistently described human civilization as something inherited rather than built. They never claim humans were the first. So the question that haunts every translated tablet remains if the Sumerians described a world that existed before humanity. Structured, working, and governed. What were they recording? Were they preserving a distorted memory of an earlier culture, one that collapsed before the Sumerians arrived? In Mesopotamia, were they encoding political legitimacy by placing their institutions in deep time? Were they describing something that actually happened in a way we no longer have the categories to recognize? The tablets won't tell us. They simply refuse to behave like mythology is supposed to behave. And the first claim they make, the foundation everything else builds on, is this: humans were not here first. Humans were not here first. That much is clear. But the Sumerian texts go further than simply placing gods before humanity. They describe an entire administrative system, a working civilization that operated without human participation. The structure wasn't abstract. The gods didn't hover in some foggy realm, making vague decisions about creation. They lived in specific cities. They governed defined territories. They had job descriptions. The debate between sheep and grain, a Sumerian text dating to the 3rd millennium BC, describes a time when mankind had not yet been created and grain had not yet been brought forth. During this period, the Anunnaki knew not the eating of bread, and dressed in plant-like clothing. The text portrays them as physically present, but lacking the agricultural abundance that would later define Mesopotamian civilization. Then Enki and Enlil create sheep and grain specifically to feed the Anunnaki. Only after this support system is established do humans appear, created to take over the farming and herding, so the gods no longer have to manage food production themselves. The story sequence is consistent. Divine need creates structure. Structure requires maintenance. Maintenance requires labor. Labor requires humans. In the Enki and Inma myth, the reason is even more direct. The text describes the Anunnaki digging rivers and canals, piling up silt from the riverbed, exhausting themselves with manual labor. The goddess Nama hears their complaints and brings the matter to Enki, who designs the solution: fashion human workers from clay. The text doesn't describe this as a generous gift of life. It describes it as engineering, problem solving through creation. Humans are the product of divine labor fatigue. But here's what the texts never explain: who built the cities the gods were living in before humans existed. If Eridu was Enki's city, and Nippur was Enlil's city, and Uruk was Inanna's city, who constructed the temples? Who laid the foundations? Who dug the first canals? The Sumerians. Don't say. The infrastructure simply exists in the story, already ancient, already working. The Barton cylinder, a cuneiform text from Lagash, describes Enlil as the one who founded all the settlements and Enki as the one who laid the foundations of Eridu, but it never describes the act of building itself. The cities are presented as results, not processes. They appear complete, as if the story begins after the work is already done. Similarly, the territorial divisions among the gods are described as settled facts rather than negotiated agreements. And ruled the heavens. Enlil governed the air and the earth's surface. Enki controlled the freshwater abyss beneath the earth. Ninhursag managed the mountainous regions. These weren't titles earned through conquest or struggle. They were assignments that existed from the beginning. The hymn to Enlil describes him as the one whose pronouncements cannot be altered, and the one who determines destinies. His authority isn't questioned or explained. It simply is. The text treats his rule the way we describe gravity, as a basic property of how the world works. The same pattern appears in the cylinder seals and administrative tablets that reference the Anunnaki. They're not pictured as distant cosmic forces. They're shown attending assemblies, receiving offerings, inspecting irrigation works. One seal shows Enki with water flowing from his shoulders, literal streams coming from his body while standing before a temple. Structure. These are not pictures of abstract ideas. They're portraits of managers overseeing infrastructure. The problem for modern interpretation is that we have no framework for this kind of story. It's not mythology in the way we understand mythology. It lacks the symbolic layers, the clear moral lessons, the familiar patterns. It's not history in any normal sense. It describes events outside biological possibility and geological time. It sits in a space we haven't named. The Sumerians themselves seem aware of the strangeness. Later, Babylonian scholars who copied and preserved these older texts sometimes added glosses, small notes, trying to interpret the material. But even those interpreters, working 1,500 years after the original writings, couldn't fully explain what they were reading. They preserved the numbers. They maintained the timeline. They copied the claims exactly. They just couldn't confirm them. No. Archaeological evidence has emerged showing a pre-human civilization in Mesopotamia. No genetic data suggests humanity was engineered rather than evolved. No geological record confirms a managed world before humans lived there. But crucially, no evidence contradicts the claims either. The texts describe a managed world before humanity, and the physical record stays silent on the matter. Not dismissive, not confirming. Silent. And that silence, more than any artifact, is what makes these tablets so hard to categorize. The Sumerians weren't guessing. They were recording. And whatever they were recording placed humanity firmly in second position. Inheritors of a system they didn't build, workers in cities they didn't found, followers of laws they didn't write. The question isn't whether this literally happened. The question is why would the world's first historians begin their history this way? The answer might lie in what they believed about power itself. The opening line of the Sumerian king list doesn't describe kingship as invented, earned, or seized. It uses a single, specific verb that appears nowhere else in Sumerian political writing. Kingship descended from heaven, not rose from the earth, not emerged from the people, not developed through social contract or military conquest. Descended. The word choice is precise and deliberate. In Sumerian administrative language, from above is literal spatial language. The Warian descends or birds descend. The king list applies this physical verb to a political idea. Authority moved downward through space before it moved forward through time. This is not how civilizations usually describe their own beginnings. Egyptian pharaohs claimed divinity, but they claimed it through bloodline, through being descended from gods, not through receiving power that literally fell from the sky. The pharaoh was Horus on earth, a god in human form, part of an eternal cosmic cycle. Power flowed through him because of what he was, not because of what had been transferred to him. Chinese emperors claimed the mandate of heaven, but that mandate was conditional, tied to virtue, removable through failure, proven through natural disasters or military defeat. Heaven judged. Heaven withdrew support. But heaven didn't physically deliver kingship like cargo. Greek rulers claimed divine favor or descent from heroes. But they never claimed that political authority itself, the idea of rulership, had been handed down from Olympus as a separate transferable object. The Sumerian model is different. Kingship is described not as an inborn quality or earned status, but as a possession, something that can be given, moved, and taken away. After the flood, the king list states then kingship descended from heaven a second time. Kingship was in Kish a second time. The wording implies the first descent. And that kingship was withdrawn, stored, and then delivered again to a different place after the floodwaters fell. This isn't metaphor. This isn't poetry about legitimacy. This is administrative language describing the movement of authority as if it were a physical asset being transferred between accounts. And it gets stranger. The list tracks kingship moving from city to city, Kish to Uruk, Uruk to Ur to Awan, Awan back to Kish. Each transfer is marked by the phrase then X was defeated. And its kingship was carried to Y, carried, not claimed, not inherited, not conquered in the sense of one ruler simply replacing another. The kingship itself, the office, the authority, the power, is described as an object in transit. This implies something extraordinary. Political power in Sumer was understood as external to the rulers who held it. The king didn't embody authority. He temporarily possessed it. And that possession could be taken back. The lamentation over the destruction of Ur, composed around 2000 BC, supports this. The text describes the goddess Ninjal pleading with an Enlil to spare the city of Ur from destruction. Their pleas are rejected. And Enlil decreed that Ur's kingship must be transferred to another city. The text states clearly Ur was granted kingship. But it was not granted an eternal reign. Not eternal, conditional, temporary. This is deeply different from how we think about ancient monarchy. We think of kings as individuals who rise through strength, inheritance, or political maneuvering. But the Sumerian texts describe kingship as something independent of the king. A framework that exists above and beyond whoever is sitting on the throne. And crucially, that framework didn't begin with humans. The hymn to Inanna describes the goddess holding the me of kingship, the essential attribute that defines royal authority among her many divine possessions. She can bestow it. She can withhold it. In one story cycle, she literally takes the me from Enki's city of Eridu and transfers them to her own city of Uruk, causing a political crisis among the gods. Kingship is property, divine property. Human rulers, in this framework, are not the source of their own authority. They're administrators operating under delegation. The king lists records their names not as founders of power, but as temporary holders of an office that comes before them and will outlast them. This has profound implications for how the Sumerians understood their own political system. They didn't believe they built civilization and then crowned kings to manage it. They believed the crown existed first, held by non-human hands, and was later loaned to humanity under conditions that could be revoked. So when the texts say kingship descended from heaven, they're not speaking metaphorically about divine approval. They're making a claim about the origin of political authority. Itself, that rule arrived from outside, was imposed from above, and remains at its core not fully human. The question isn't whether we believe this happened. The question is why did they accord kingship this way? Perhaps the answer is hidden in how they measured it. The Sumerian king list doesn't just claim early rulers lived impossibly long. It measures those lifespans using specific mathematical units that appear nowhere else in Sumerian timekeeping. Three terms dominate the antediluvian section: Sar, Ner, and Su. 1 Sar equals 3,600 years. 1 Ner equals 600 years. 1 Su equals 60 years. These aren't guesses or poetic exaggerations. They're exact mathematical values. Multiples of 60, the base unit of Sumerian mathematics. The same sexagesimal system the Sumerians used to calculate field areas, grain, volumes, and temple building measurements. Alulim's reign of 28,800 years, that's exactly 8 Sar. Alalgar's 36,000 years, 10 Sar. And Menuana's 43,200 years, 12 Sar. The pattern holds through every antediluvian ruler. The numbers aren't random. They're structured, calculated, built from standard units used in administrative math. This is the same numerical precision Sumerian scribes use for tax collection and irrigation schedules. They're counting something. The problem is we don't know what. If these were symbolic numbers meant to show a very long time ago, why use exact mathematical units? Why not simply say countless years or ages beyond memory? Sumerian literature has plenty of poetic language for deep time. The Ritter Genesis describes days of long ago and distant days when speaking generally about the past. But the king list doesn't use vague language. It uses accounting. And accounting doesn't exaggerate. It specifies. Some scholars have suggested the Sar means something other than solar years, perhaps lunar cycles. Seasonal cycles, or generations. Divide 28,800 by 12 and you get 2,400, still impossible for a human lifespan. But less absurd. Divide by 30 and you get a possible 80 years. But the text never says any conversion is needed. Later entries in the king list covering historically verified rulers from the 3rd millennium BC use normal year counts that match archaeological timelines. Those numbers work. They match reign lengths we can confirm from temple records and diplomatic letters. The scribes who compiled the king list knew how to count years normally. They did so for 2/3 of the documents. They just didn't do it for the earliest section. And they never explained why. No Sumerian text, not hymns, not commentaries, not temple records offers any note about these numbers. No scribe added a line saying this represents symbolic time or these figures use a different calendar. The numbers simply stand there, unbroken, as if they needed no defense. Later Babylonian copies of the king list preserve the same values exactly. Scribes living 1,500 years after the original composition, working in a different language, under different political systems, still copy the antediluvian reign lengths without changes or notes. Whatever these numbers meant, the tradition of keeping them untouched was stronger than the urge to explain them. The postdiluvian section introduces another timeline problem. After the flood, the king list states kingship returned to Kish. The first ruler, Jushur, reigned for 1,200 years. The next, Kulasinable, reigned for 960 years. The third, Nanjishlishma, 670 years. These aren't measured in Su units. They're measured in regular years, but they're still biologically impossible. The reign lengths slowly fall 420 years, 300 years, 240 years until around the dynasty of Uruk. They begin approaching believable human lifespans. Gilgamesh is listed as reigning 126 years. His successor, Urnungal, 30 years. By the time the list reaches the historically verified 3rd dynasty of Ur, the numbers match archaeological evidence exactly. This creates a slow descent from impossible time into historical time, with no clear line marking where one ends and the other begins. It's as if the Sumerians were describing a world where time itself worked differently, then slowly settled into the timeline we recognize. But they don't say that. They just list the numbers and move on. The lack of explanation is more disturbing than the numbers themselves. We're used to ancient texts that explain their symbolism. The Bible places Methuselah's 969 years inside a theological story about human corruption and divine patience. Egyptian texts frame the eternal reign of pharaohs inside the cosmic cycle of Mad. Sumerian texts don't frame anything. They record. And what they recorded creates a timeline that doesn't collapse neatly into mythology or history. The king list begins in a time measured in units we can't interpret, tracking rulers who reigned for spans humans can't survive, gradually transitioning into verified historical figures whose reigns we can confirm through independent sources. The document moves from impossible to possible without admitting the move. So we're left with a text that uses mathematical precision to record biological impossibility, preserved by scribes who treated it as real enough to copy faithfully, but never real enough to explain. The Sumerians measured something in those early dynasties. They measured it carefully. They just measured it in a time that refuses to behave like time should. The silence around those measurements is total. but the locations are not. While Sumerian texts refuse to explain when the Anunnaki ruled, they are extremely specific about where the gods lived. They don't live in a vague sky realm or some abstract spiritual dimension. They live in cities-specific cities with postal codes, if such things had existed. Enki lives in Eridu. Enlil rules from Nippur. Nana oversees Ur. Inanna rules Uruk. Ninhursag manages Adab. Udu controls Sippur. Ninjursu commands Lagash. These aren't symbolic connections. They're jurisdictions. The Sumerian temple hymns, a set of 42 hymns composed around 2300 BC, functions almost like a divine census. Each hymn speaks to a specific temple in a specific city, names the god who lives there, and catalogs their responsibilities. The structure reads like an administrative directory. Temple of Enki in Eridu manages the underground freshwater ocean, oversees ritual purification, controls wisdom and craftsmanship. Temple of Enlil in Nippur determines political authority, commands storm and wind, carries out divine decrees. Temple of Nana in Ur regulates the lunar calendar, oversees trade routes, manages cattle herding. The geographic precision goes beyond city assignments. Some texts describe property boundaries. The debate between Ho and Plow mentions Enlil's estate in Nippur, including references to specific fields and irrigation channels. The hymn to Inanna describes her temple complex in Uruk with architectural detailed courtyards, gates, storage rooms, sleeping quarters. These are not metaphors living in poetic space. These are addresses. What makes this especially striking is how unusual it is compared to other ancient pantheons. Greek gods lived on Mount Olympus, a real mountain, yes, but one that existed outside normal city administration. They didn't govern Athens or Sparta directly. They influenced human affairs from a distance through oracles and sudden interventions, but they didn't keep houses in the agora. Norse gods lived in Asgard, a realm separate from Midgard, where humans lived. The connection between divine and human worlds required crossing a literal bridge. The Bifrost separated the two realities. Egyptian gods were more localized, with specific cult centers Ptah in Memphis, Ra in Heliopolis, Amun in Thebes. But Egyptian theology emphasized the gods' cosmic nature. There were forces that showed up in certain places but existed beyond geography. The Sumerian model is flipped. The Anunnaki aren't cosmic forces who sometimes show up in cities. They're residents of cities who happen to control cosmic forces. Cylinder seals support this. Hundreds of seals from the 3rd millennium BC show gods seated in architectural settings, temples, palaces, administrative buildings. They show receiving offerings, reviewing workers, inspecting fields. 1 seal from Lagash shows Ninjursu with farming tools overseeing irrigation works. Another from Ur shows Nana with scribes presenting tablets accounts. Ledgers apparently needing divine approval. These aren't portraits of untouchable beings. These are portraits of management. The texts also describe land disputes among the gods that read exactly like border conflicts between human city-states. The dispute between Inanna and Enki tells how Inanna traveled to Eridu, got Enki drunk, and stole over 100 divine attributes and cultural innovations, moving them from his jurisdiction to hers. Enki sends servants to chase her and retrieve the stolen property. She escapes. The me remain in Uruk. This is theft, geographic theft, political theft. The border conflict between Lagash and Umma involves the god Ninjursu directly. The text describes how Ninjursu's territory was encroached on by the city of Umma, and how he personally stepped into the dispute not through vague divine favor, but through specific recorded legal action. The boundary stones marking the divine property line were inscribed with his name. Property law involving gods. Temple archives from Gursu contain economic records tracking offerings delivered to specific gods, monthly rations of bread, beer, and livestock, itemized by recipients. Inanna receives X amount. Ninurta receives Y amount. The Musia receives Z amount. The tablets specify not just what was delivered, but where, which temple, which room, which altar. These are delivery receipts. The bureaucratic language even extends to divine travel. When gods move between cities. In Sumerian stories, the texts describe the logistics. The journey of Nana to Nippur catalogs every city Nana passes through on his way to visit Enlil, listing the local gods who greet him at each stop. It reads like a diplomatic itinerary, complete with protocol and ceremony. So, the texts present gods who don't rise above geography. They're rooted in it. They don't watch cities from a distance. They live in them. They don't symbolize political power. They use it through ordinary administrative channels, complete with property records, economic accounts, and border disputes. The Anunnaki are described behaving like governors managing provinces inside a larger bureaucratic system, which raises the question: if they governed like officials, what government were they officials of? The texts never say. They just keep listing addresses. If they governed like officials, what government were they officials of? The flood story suggests they didn't. No either. The writer Genesis, the oldest known Sumerian flood account, describes the decision to send the deluge as a consensus among the divine assembly. The gods agreed. The gods decreed. The gods set the flood in motion. And then, when the waters rose, the gods fled in terror. The text states, the Anunnaki lifted up their torches, setting the land ablaze with their flare. The crushing silence of the storm god passed over, turning all light to darkness. They didn't command the storm. They ran from it. The Atrahasis epic is even clearer. When the floodwaters begin to rise, Enlil seals the water sources shut. But the flood doesn't stop. It grows beyond control. The gods retreat to the highest heaven, crouching like dogs, cowering against the outer wall. Cowering. That's the word the text uses. Not observing, not overseeing cowering. The gods press themselves against the walls of heaven like animals seeking shelter, watching the destruction they started and realizing they can no longer manage it. Then comes the starvation. The Epic of Gilgamesh, Tablet 11, preserves the most detailed account. After 7 days and nights of flood, the text describes the gods crouching like dogs and says, the Anunnaki wept with her. The gods sat, weeping. Their lips were parched with thirst during a flood. The detail is almost ridiculous in how specific it is, except the text explains with humanity destroyed. There are no more temple offerings, no bread, no beer, no roasted meat. The sacrifice system has collapsed, and the gods apparently depended on it. The goddess Ishtar cries out, the olden days are turned to clay. I commanded evil in the assembly of the gods. How could I command such evil in the assembly of the gods? How could I command war to destroy my people? For it is I who give birth to my people. This isn't all-powerfulness. This is regret born from consequences the gods didn't see coming. When the flood finally goes down, and the survivor Utnapishtim offers sacrifice, the text describes the gods' reaction with disturbing hunger. The gods smelled the sweet savor. The gods crowded like flies around the sacrifice. Like flies. The imagery strips away every trace of calm, untouchable authority. These beings aren't serene, self-sufficient cosmic powers. They're desperate, hungry, dependent on human offerings for survival. The sacrifice isn't symbolic worship. It's real food. They truly need. Enlil arrives late to the gathering, and seeing the boat, flies into rage who escaped. No man was to survive the destruction. He confronts him. How could you, unreasoning, bring on the deluge? On the sinner impose his sin. On the transgressor impose his transgression. But be lenient, lest he be cut off. Be patient, lest he be dislodged. He accuses Enlil of being unreasoning, of acting without proper calculation, of wiping out humanity without thinking about the consequences. This is political criticism, one official calling out another for administrative incompetence. And Enlil, supreme god of wind and authority, listens. He repents. He blesses Utnapishtim, and grants him immortality as compensation. Then the divine assembly swears an oath recorded clearly in multiple versions of the flood story, never again. They bind themselves legally to never repeat the act. This behavior pattern shows up nowhere else in ancient flood myth. In the biblical account, God floods the earth deliberately, exactly, and with full control. He saves Noah on purpose. He makes a covenant with humanity. Afterward, from a position of absolute authority. There may be sadness, but no panic. No hunger, no desperate struggle to contain a disaster that went further than expected. In Greek mythology, Zeus floods the earth to punish human wickedness. He watches from Olympus. When it's done, he lets Deucalion and Per survive and repopulate. The gods aren't affected. They don't cower. They don't starve. They remain untouched by the catastrophe they caused. The Sumerian version is different. The Anunnaki unleash something they can't control, suffer physical consequences they didn't expect, and swear legally binding oaths to limit their own future actions. This is not how all-powerful beings behave. This is how officials behave when a policy decision goes disastrously wrong, when the damage is worse than predicted, when unintended consequences spill beyond control, when authority figures realize they aren't as powerful as they thought. The flood breaks the story of divine control. It shows vulnerability, dependence, and mistakes. And it forces a question the texts never answer. If the gods couldn't fully control the disaster they themselves started, what were they actually able to control? If the gods couldn't fully control the disaster they started, what were they actually capable of controlling? According to the texts, everything that came after. The Sumerian word me appears in over 50 different tablets, hymns, and epics. It is usually translated as divine decree or fundamental attribute, but neither translation captures how specific it is. The me weren't abstract ideas. There were separate packages of knowledge and ability. Over 100 individual me are listed. across different texts. They include kingship, priesthood, truth, descent into the underworld, ascent from the underworld, metalworking, leatherwork, building, agriculture, writing, music, the art of love, the art of war, judgment, decision-making, and dozens more. Each bee is treated as a distinct possession, something that can be held, transferred, stolen, or lost. The Inanna and Enki's story describes how Inanna traveled to Eridu specifically to attain the me from Enki. She didn't discover them or develop them through experience. She acquired them through manipulation, yes. But the point is they existed as transferable objects before she possessed them. Enki held them first, before humans existed. The me of agriculture didn't come from generations of trial and error. It was handed down. The me of writing wasn't invented through slow symbol changes. It was received. Every foundational element of Mesopotamian civilization is framed in Sumerian literature as inheritance, not invention. The farmer's instructions, a Sumerian agricultural manual dating to the 3rd millennium BC, opens with the line, "In days of yore, a farmer instructed his son." But the text isn't describing folk wisdom passed between generations of human farmers. Earlier in the composition, it mentions instructions given by the god Ninurta. The farmer is teaching his son what was taught to humanity. The same pattern appears in the hymn to the pickaxe, which credits Enlil with creating the tool and showing its use, not inspiring humans to invent it. Showing it. The text describes Enlil literally showing humans how to strike the earth, how to angle the blade, how to use the tool for canal construction. This is teaching, not inspiration. Temple ritual texts support the same pattern. The Kish temple hymn describes how Nanch taught the proper rites to her priestesses, not inspired, taught. The text preserves exact wording for prayers, precise measurements for offerings, specific timing for ceremonies. The level of detail suggests the original instructions were technical manuals, not poetic suggestions. But beneath this framework of divine instruction sits something even more unsettling: the idea that humans were the first students. The Atrahasis epic states clearly that before humanity was created, the Igigi gods did the labor of maintaining civilization. They dug canals. They carried baskets of earth. They maintained the irrigation systems. Then they revolted, and humans were created to replace them. The text never explains what happened to the Igigi after the replacement. They simply disappear from the story. Their labor is handed over to the newly created workforce. The debate between copper and silver contains a broken reference to those who carried the earth before men. No detail, no names, just a admission that someone came before humanity in the role of labor. The Eridu Genesis describes the creation of humans using the phrase to bear the yoke, language that implies an existing yoke once carried by someone else, now being transferred. These aren't creation stories in the usual sense. They're replacement stories. Humans aren't the beginning of civilization's labor force. They're the second version, or maybe the third. The texts don't say, and they don't explain why the replacement was needed. Revolt is mentioned in the Atrahasis account. Failures are hinted at in other fragments, but the fate of the earlier laborers remains unstated. They vanish from the record the same way they entered it, without explanation. What remains is a clear story pattern. Humans inherited a system that was already working. The cities were built. The fields were planned. The canals were dug. The knowledge was compiled. Humans arrived to maintain infrastructure they hadn't designed and run systems they hadn't invented. Enki and the world order describes Enki traveling from city to city, assigning roles, handing out responsibilities, establishing functions. He doesn't consult humans. He doesn't cooperate. He decrees. And the text describes humans learning their assigned tasks. This isn't the story of human innovation we tell ourselves about the Neolithic Revolution, the slow development of agriculture, the gradual building of technical knowledge, the trial and error rise of complex society. The Sumerian text describes something closer to onboarding humans being trained for jobs in an organization that existed before they joined it. The question isn't whether this literally happened. The question is, why did the world's first civilization consistently describe itself this way? As receivers rather than creators, as students rather than inventors, as replacements rather than pioneers. Why they never claimed credit for building what they maintained might relate to who controlled the original blueprints. And the text suggests that control was never unified. The Anunnaki didn't operate as one smooth hierarchy. They acted like a fractured political body, complete with voting procedures, factional alliances, and territorial disputes that needed formal judgment. The myth of Anzu describes a crisis in divine government when the bird demon Anzu steals the tablet of destinies, a physical object that gave supreme authority over the cosmos. With the tablet stolen, Enlil loses his power to issue binding decrees. The divine assembly meets in an emergency session. 3 gods refuse the mission to recover the tablet before Ninurta finally accepts. This isn't symbolic drama. The text describes gods, refusing orders, bargaining terms, and weighing personal risk against group benefit. The assembly debates. It votes. Individual members refuse instructions from their supposed superior. The Era and Isham story describes the conflict between Marduk and Era over who should rule Babylon. Era undermines Marduk's authority, triggering political chaos. The text shows Marduk leaving his city entirely, withdrawing to decide whether to return. During his absence, Babylon suffers. The story treats divine withdrawal as having direct administrative results, not spiritual symbolism, but real government failure. The debate between bird and fish preserves an arbitration. Two gods argue over which domain contributes more to civilization. The dispute requires Enlil to give a formal judgment. The text reads like court proceedings, with each side presenting evidence and Enlil giving a binding verdict. These aren't religious parables about cosmic balance. These are descriptions of political dysfunction needing procedural solutions. But the factional conflicts aren't the most unsettling part. The withdrawal stories are. Sumerian texts repeatedly describe gods departing, ascending, or becoming unreachable, but never dying. The difference is critical. Death stories exist for minor gods like Dumuzi, who descends to the underworld in cycles. But the major Anunnaki who govern cities and hold authority don't have death stories. They have departure stories. The lament for Sumer. And describes the gods abandoning their cities before destruction. Nana has left his city. Ninjal has left her house. Enki has left his temple. The language is geographic and deliberate. They left, not died, not banished, left. The curse of Agade describes Inanna removing her protection from the city of Agade, taking her weapons and divine attributes with her. The text specifies she went up to heaven along with 7 other major gods. The city collapses after their departure, not because they're dead, but because they're absent. The phrase went up to heaven or returned to heaven appears across multiple Sumerian texts, describing divine withdrawal. It's treated as a reversible geographic action, not a polite way to say death. The gods don't stop existing. They relocate. Out of reach. The Riddle lament mourns the city's decline by describing Enki's withdrawal from his temple. The text doesn't say he died or was defeated. It says he stayed away from his city. Distance creates the crisis, not death. This pattern extends to the shift from direct divine presence to temple-based religion. Earlier Sumerian texts describe gods living physically in their temple complexes, receiving offerings directly, giving commands to priests in person. Later texts describe the same gods as distant, reachable only through ritual steps and priestly mediation. The hymn to Enlil from the Earth 3 period states, Enlil, when you marked off holy settlements on earth, you built Nippur as your very own city, present tense active residence. But later Babylonian prayers speak to gods in temples as if they're elsewhere, asking them to turn their face toward the petitioner or incline their ear. The language assumes absence. That requires deliberate attention, not presence that requires only recognition. The shift isn't explained. The gods don't announce they're leaving forever. They simply become harder and harder to reach. The lamentation over the destruction of Sumer. And describes this transition plainly. The gods have abandoned us like migrating birds. They have gone away. They have risen to heaven. The comparison is telling. Migrating birds leave seasonally, but they aren't dead. They're elsewhere. And the possibility of return remains open in the language. What's missing from Sumerian literature is any grand divine death story. Like other myth systems, Osiris dies and is raised in Egyptian myth. Balder dies in Norse tradition. Dionysus is torn apart and reborn in Greek cycles. These deaths matter religiously. They're remembered. They shape ritual calendars. The major Anunnaki simply withdraw, and their withdrawal is treated not as poetic myth, but as historical event with administrative consequences. Cities decline. Temple economies collapse. Ritual knowledge becomes harder to keep. The texts describe these outcomes plainly, like reporting economic effects after key officials resign. So the divine government system that supposedly existed before humanity didn't end in an apocalyptic battle or mythic sunset. It ended in withdrawal, broken up, gradual, and unexplained. The gods didn't die. They became unreachable. And the texts preserve that unreachability without resolving it, leaving later Sumerian priests maintaining temples for residents who are no longer present but were never declared gone. The question isn't where they went. The question is why the Sumerians recorded the departure as if it were verifiable and administrative fact rather than a religious interpretation. Why the Sumerians recorded the departure as verifiable might be the most revealing detail of all, because they weren't recording departures they witnessed. They were copying accounts of departures that came before them. The confession appears in the colophons, the scribal notes written at the end of tablets, again and Again, Sumerian scribes admit they were working from older sources. Sources already broken, already hard to read. One colophon from Nippur states written from an ancient original which was unclear. Another, from a copy of the Eridu Genesis, says the scribe copied from an old tablet that was damaged. The scribes weren't inventing these stories. They were saving them unfinished, confusing, often contradictory. They kept traditions they no longer fully understood, according impossible timelines without explanation, copying rain lengths they couldn't verify, preserving geographic details about gods who were no longer present. The Sumerians themselves were archivists of a past that was already ancient when they found it. By the time the Sumerian king list was compiled around 2100 BC, the antediluvian section was already describing events supposedly 30,000 years earlier, events no living tradition could have carried orally without huge distortion. Yet the scribes copied the numbers faithfully, applied mathematical precision to claims they couldn't confirm, and structured the timeline as if it were continuous with their presence. They didn't label these accounts as myth. They didn't label them as legend. They stored them in the same archives that held tax records and legal codes. Temple inventories from the Earth 3 period list ritual objects described as from the old temple or from before the time of the grandfathers. The priests running these temples in 2100 BC were handling artifacts they couldn't date, performing ceremonies whose original purpose had been forgotten, reciting prayers in archaic Sumerian that needed translation into their own current dialect. They were performing rituals for gods who had become more and more distant, in temples built for a kind of worship that no longer worked as designed. The emotional weight isn't in what the Anunnaki supposedly did. It's in watching the Sumerians struggle to keep a connection with something they could no longer reach, copying texts that confused them, preserving numbers that made no sense, maintaining temples for residents who had withdrawn. They kept the archives. They continued the offerings. They taught the traditions to the next generation of scribes. But the explanatory framework, the living context that would have made these records understandable, was gone. And here's what archaeology tells us: nothing. No artifact has emerged proving the Anunnaki ruled before humans. No genetic evidence confirms humanity was created as replacement labor. No geological record validates 30,000-year reign lengths. No excavation has uncovered technology that predates the Neolithic Revolution. But crucially, nothing disproves it either. No archaeological evidence contradicts the Sumerian claims. The silence isn't mocking. It's just silent. The physical record neither confirms or denies. It offers no competing story, no alternate timeline that would make the Sumerian accounts impossible. We're left with testimony that archaeology can't answer, claims that live in a space where material evidence can't reach. Which brings us to the reversal. We assume myth comes from ignorance, that early humans, lacking science, invented gods to explain thunder, fertility, and death. That mythology is humanity's first confused attempt to make sense of a world they didn't understand. But the Sumerian pattern suggests something different. They don't describe inventing the Anunnaki to explain natural events. They describe inheriting records about the Anunnaki and struggling to explain what those records meant. They don't claim to have created the stories. They claim to have preserved them. The confusion runs in the opposite direction. Their records show they knew how to build cities, manage irrigation, do mathematics, organize labor, and run complex bureaucracies. They weren't primitive. They were advanced, and that advanced civilization looked backward at something even older and couldn't fully understand it. Perhaps mythology doesn't come before knowledge. Perhaps, in some cases, mythology is what remains after knowledge has been lost, stories that survive when the context that would make them understandable has eroded. The Sumerians recorded something. They recorded it carefully, preserved it across centuries, structured it with administrative precision. They just couldn't explain what they were recording. And neither can we. We have the tablets. We have the translations. We have the timelines, the city lists, the divine jurisdictions, the impossible reign lengths, the flood accounts, the withdrawal stories. We have everything except the framework that would make them fit into something we recognize. So the claims remain 10 testimonies from the world's first civilization, recorded with bureaucratic care, preserved through time, describing a past that refuses to fit our categories. Not confirmed, not dismissed, simply there, waiting in clay for someone, someday, who might know how to read.